Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. I'm your host and co-author of Patriot's History of the United States, Larry Schweikart. Mike Allen is my co-author, and we've been reading through the book. I am, as always, using the 15th anniversary edition of Patriot's History of the United States, just in case someone joined us new. If you have an earlier version, if you have 10th anniversary version, you're going to be okay in almost all respects. If you go back too much before that, certainly the pages won't line up, and a few of the headers may be different. So you may have to search around to find where I'm starting. But if you got the 15th anniversary edition, you can go right to the header or the page. And we are on page 155. With the header, Republicans versus Federalists. These fierce disputes created a political enmity Washington and others sought to avoid. Two vibrant disputing political parties instead of consensus. Although Republicans and Federalists of the 1790s may appear old-fashioned in comparison to modern politicians, they perform the same vital functions that characterize members of all modern political parties. They nominated candidates, conducted election campaigns, wrote platforms, pamphlets, newspaper editorials, organized partisan activity within the executive and legislative branches of government, dispensed patronage, and even conducted social events like parties and barbecues, fish fries, and so on. Unfortunately, some have overgeneralized about the parties, characterizing them as rich versus poor men's parties, big government versus small government parties, or even pro-slavery and anti-slavery parties. The truth is much more complex. The Federalists and Republicans were closely related to their 1787 through 89 start that one again. The Federalists and Republicans were closely related to their 1787 to 89 Federalist and anti-Federalist predecessors. For the most part, Republicans were more rural and agricultural than their Federalist opponents, whereas an Alexander Hamilton would always be suspicious of the masses and their passions. To the Republicans, quote, honest majorities unmolested by priests, quacks, and selfish deceivers necessarily would make good decisions. In our day and age, I'm reminded of the late William F. Buckley Jr., who himself was quite an elite. I mean, he was in the top, right? And he used to say, in his way, he'd lean back in his chair, I would much rather be governed by the first 500 names in the Boston phone book than by the people in Congress today, or words to that effect. He had a great style about it. He was pretty funny. And so there's something to that. This did not mean that all Republicans were poor yeoman farmers, because much of their leadership, for example, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, consisted of affluent Southern planters, and at the same time, affluent merchants and entrepreneurs, I could add even landowners in New York, led a Federalist following of poorer, aspiring middle-class tradesmen. Because the northeastern part of the United States is more populous and enjoyed a more diverse economy than the agricultural South and West, this rural-urban dichotomy tended to manifest itself into a Southern-Western versus Northeastern party alignment. Characterizing the first party system as one of agrarian versus cosmopolitan interests, however, would not be wholly inaccurate. Ideologically, the Republicans clung to the anti-federalist radical Whig embrace of small, democratic, decentralized government. They accepted the Constitution, but they read and interpreted it closely. Strict constructionism, this is called, with special attention to the first 10 amendments. In this spirit, they retained their suspicion of direct taxation and standing armies. In foreign policy, they were naturally drawn to the radical French revolutionaries. Federalists, on the other hand, continued their drift toward a policy of expansive, vigorous national government, certainly not a monarchy or coercive state, but a government that nevertheless could tax, fight, regulate commerce, and provide Hamilton's revered general welfare for all Americans. Federalists wanted a viable army and a foreign policy that courted New England's foremost trading partner, Great Britain. Members of both parties strongly believed in republican government and the division of power. Both aimed to use the Constitution to govern fairly and avoid a return to authoritarianism, and both ultimately rejected the violence as a legitimate means of achieving their political goals. While both groups feared tyranny, only the Federalists thought it likely to come from the masses as easily as from a monarch, with Adams arguing that, quote, unbridled majorities are as tyrannical and cruel as unlimited despots. You know, in our recent bout with the China virus, I think we can agree that the masses can be organized and weaponized really against everybody. You had large numbers of people wanting to basically force vaccinations on everybody who didn't want them. And they were pretty vocal about it. If given their way, they probably would have physically forced people to get vaxxed. So I don't think Adams is entirely wrong here. By the way, what saved us from that? It was the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court allowed the military, mandated vaccines for the military. And the reason for that is the military's always had mandated vaccines. It was pretty hard for the court to say, but not in this case. That wasn't going to go. But the Supreme Court rolled it back for private businesses and almost all other places that were in the public sphere. Now, private organizations such as private colleges could still enforce mandatory vaccines because you didn't have to go there, but you could claim religious exceptions, and people did, and people won those. So I'm just saying, we get all democratic, and we start to think those Federalists were a bunch of uptight monarchists, when really they were arguing for careful separation of powers so that neither the elites or the monarch or the masses could oppress the other groups. One supremely important issue is missing from the list: slavery. It would be hard to claim that the Federalists were anti-slave, especially with slaveholders such as Washington at the helm. On the other hand, it would seem to be equally difficult to paint the small government Republicans as pro-slave. Yet that is exactly the direction in which each party respectively was headed, because of their view of general welfare and equality for all, but even more so because of their northern origins. The Federalists laid the framework for ultimately insisting that all men are created equal, and that included anyone defined as a man, or, as they said in the Constitution, a person, right? Person who owed labor to other people, but a person. Under other circumstances, few Republicans would have denied this or even attempted to defend the pro-slavery position. Their defense of states' rights, however, pushed them inevitably into the pro-slavery corner. I know some of you are going to freak out about this, so let's just get it over with right now. States' rights was about one state right only: the right to own slaves. Now, I will lay this out. Mike and I lay this out in excruciating detail. It's impossible, really, to argue this position. And it's made clear by the Confederate Constitution of 1861 that says not once, not twice, but 3 times it has clauses referring specifically to slavery, not to unfree persons. because the Confederacy did not define a slave as a person. So if you look at it in this way, the whole gist, the whole trend of history from this point forward, when it comes to states' rights, is the right of states to allow slavery. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the tariff. They will often try to conceal it or frame it in terms of the tariff. That wasn't it. Because they never went to war over a tariff. Tariff of abominations was many times worse than any other tariff. They didn't fight over that. And only one state even threatened to stop collecting tariffs, and that was South Carolina. But when it came to slavery, they immediately fought over that. And we will soon see the whole framework of all of the territorial expansion was done under the auspices of adding more slave states to the Union, or, in contrast, adding more free states to the Union. Why was that important? Because ultimately, we would have a vote. If we didn't have a war, we would have a vote. And that vote, ultimately, if the South couldn't somehow weasel out enough slave states, that vote was going to eventually come down to abolish slavery, and the South wasn't going to have it. I will lay all this out for you in the coming weeks and months. It's nothing we're going to get to immediately, but if your bent is to say that, oh, states' rights, we got to have states' rights, and you think that's some big clarion call for freedom, back then it was not. Back then, it was pure and simple a shroud to cover the institution of slavery. So if you're really into the other position, you might want to save yourself a lot of listening and bail out now, because that's where we're headed. Okay. We have a chart on 156, 157, how to recognize a 1790s Republican or Federalist. The leaders, the Republicans were Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Gallatin, Clinton, and Burr. Yeah, I was always in those Republicans till I became a Democrat later. I don't know. I couldn't stay there. No, Mr. President, we're not talking about you. What do you mean you're not talking about me? Everybody's always talking about me. I'm important. I'm sorry, Mr. President, not this time. Oh, okay. Well, I'll see you later. The Federalists consisted of Washington, Adams, Hamilton, Morris, Pickering, King, and Knox. Origins. Republicans were an anti-federalist faction of the Revolutionary Whigs, or remember, they were originally the Nationalists. Remember that? I'm sorry. I screwed up. They were originally the Federalists. They were originally the Federalists. See, that's how much this name twisting messes even me up. The origins of the Federalists were the Federalist faction of the Revolutionary Whigs, but they were originally known as Nationalists. Remember, the two parties switched names. The Federalists figured out how to use public relations, and they began calling themselves Federalists, when really it was the anti-federalists who were the Federalists. And that left the poor anti-federalists, the former Federalists, calling themselves anti-federalists. And as you know, anti never works. You can't be anti something. You have to be for something. Public Relations 101. Regional demographic. The Republicans were Southwest and the Middle States. Federalists were New England and the Middle States, kind of split the Middle States. Local demographic base. Republicans were rural farms, plantations, and villages. Federalists were urban cities, villages, river valleys. Economic base. Republicans were farmers, planters, artisans, and working men. Federalists were merchants, financiers, tradesmen, some exporting farmers. Class. The Republicans generally were the lower and middling classes led by a planter elite. Federalists were the upper and middling classes, a lot of blue-collar workers, mechanics as they were called at that time. We'd call them, I don't know, coopers, bricklayers, people who work with their hands. Ideology. Republicans were radical Whig. Federalists are moderate Whig. The Republicans were localists, agrarians, pro-militia, low taxation, balanced budget, egalitarian, strict construction of the Constitution, pro-French, and expansionist. Federalists were moderate Whigs, more centralist, commercial, professional military, favored taxation and deficit, more elitist, and enlightened paternalists. They were broad construction in their interpretation of the Constitution, pro-British, reluctant expansionist. Isn't that interesting? That the party that today, or rather the element of the modern Republican Party known as MAGA, Make America Great Again, are generally where you're going to find the largest number of non-expansionists, the largest number of people who oppose foreign wars. Now, there's some in the Democrat Party, people like Bobby Kennedy Jr., but not a lot. So that's kind of interesting. Most people today would erroneously, because things change so much by the time we get to these labels, but would erroneously label today's modern Democrats as the Republicans of this era. Again, not at all correct, but that's how some people, heck, when I went to high school, they were still doing this. And they would liken the Federalists to the Republicans, big government types. Well, again, the parties, and not because of civil rights, the parties have largely flipped. And today the Democrats are, I think most would agree, the party of the very wealthy and the very poor, and have lost the middle working class. You can read this on any major Democrat strategist opinion piece anywhere. They're all screaming that the Democrat Party's lost the working class of all colors. And there are some exceptions to the Republicans. Yeah, they got some really rich people, but they are, especially the MAGA wing, they have become very much the blue-collar, working-class, middle America part of the country, and not the rich, purple-haired blue bloods of the country club set. That group is disappearing within today's Republican Party. So don't use these two designations of Republicans, Federalists to draw any conclusions about today's modern parties. They've really, you could throw all those characteristics into a bag and shake it up and pour it out. You'd come out with two different piles today. Sometime in the early 1790s, Madison employed his political savvy in officially creating the Jeffersonian Republican Party. He began his organization in Congress, gathering and marshaling representatives in opposition to Hamilton's reports and Jay's treaty. To counter the Hamiltonian bias of John Finno's influential Gazette of the United States, that's a newspaper, Madison in 1791 encouraged Philip Freneau to publish a rival Republican newspaper, the National Gazette. So now you've got rivaling papers. It's good. It's good. We don't have much of that today. We don't have one single major city, not one, where you have a conservative or Republican paper with even near the clout of the liberal Democratic paper. Yes, New York has the New York Post. It's a very good paper, but it's nowhere up there in terms of prestige and readership of the New York Times. And there's no competing paper in Chicago or Detroit or DC or Phoenix or Austin or Los Angeles or San Francisco. You pick your city. All of the formerly conservative papers either have gone liberal or they've been bought out and have disappeared. The only place you find opposing voices is on the internet, on the web, on some streaming, Newsmax, One American News, places like that. Madison himself wrote anonymous National Gazette editorials lambasting Hamilton's 3 reports in Washington's foreign policy. He simultaneously cultivated national support, encouraged grassroots Republican political clubs, and awaited an opportunity to thwart the Federalist electoral dominance. When Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State in protest on January 31, 1794, after consistently being ignored by Washington, by the way, John Adams was totally ignored by Washington, the stage was set for the first national electoral showdown between the Republicans and the Federalists. It is true these were not parties in the modern sense of the word. They lacked ward, precinct, district organization, since voting was still the privilege of the few. They did not rely on getting out the vote. The few existing party papers were not comparable in influence to those of the Jacksonian age. 20 years later, and most important, these parties still relied on ideology, the person's philosophy or worldview, to produce votes. Whereas the Second American Party system, founded by Martin Van Buren and William Crawford in the 1820s, was built on much more crass principle, patronage, that is jobs, that is money, that is bribes. Still, these organs did galvanize those holding the franchise, the vote, into 1 or 2 major groups, and to that extent, they generated excitement during elections. All right, that's a good place to stop. We'll come back to democracy's first test, and we're going to find some interesting things here that relate to what I call Patriot Day, January 6, 2020, about the authority and the power and the obligation and the rights of the Vice President of the United States. And I think some people might find that pretty surprising. So I'll see you back here then. Meanwhile, first, my Twitter account is soon going to have a subscription option. I am at Larry Schweikart, okay? Capital L, capital S, at Larry Schweikart. What I'm going to do is take my longer, more analytical poll analysts, election analysts, political analysts, historical pieces I used to write in long threads. I'm going to put those under the subscription side. I'll still tweet generously, but the longer stuff will be under the subscription side, which is $5. So you might want to check that out. Second, if you want more political stuff, we are getting into the political season. Go over to the Wild World of Politics. There's all sorts of stuff there free, but also you can find my Larry's Commentary, which I do right after this show, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I basically analyze the top 3 news stories of the day, whether it's election news or anything else, and do commentary on it. That's $69 a year, same as the VIP in history. With that, you get 6 ongoing lesson programs in video form, including my brand new book that'll be released next year, A Patriot's History of Globalism. So I'm starting to lay that out video by video, what's going to be involved in A Patriot's History of Globalism. Believe me, it's worth the $69. Meanwhile, over on the Wild World of History, we're trying to turn Patriot's history into a full-length feature film. Boy, do we have a great pilot plan. It'll make you shout, USA, USA. It'll bring tears to your eyes. You'll be so glad to be an American again, and it's all 100% accurate history. Not going to fudge a whole bunch of stuff in this for dramatic impact, because we don't need to. History is great by itself. You know, history does have a wild side. So check that out. If you like the trailer that's up there, buy me a coffee, $5. Buy me a coffee. The more coffees we get, the sooner we can get this made. We've already commissioned a screenplay being written right now. We next will have to do a line budget. I'm going to need some more money for that. Help me out. And lastly, over at Wild World of History, we have ongoing video lesson series in the VIP section. There's one on enduring lessons on life and citizenship. Believe me, the one on time and money alone is worth the price of the package. But we also have Reagan, the American president. I just added a new one about 2 weeks ago. We have integrity, starting with Winston Churchill, a series about Churchill, but we'll be doing many, many more on that. So check that out. $69 here, incredible amount of resources for you and your family. And in the meantime, you can buy me a coffee. I'll see you guys back here on Wednesday.